I never thought I was going to work again. The trauma from Juicero was very real.
Walk me through the day you heard about that Bloomberg article.
I thought it was the dumbest thing ever. Like, why would Bloomberg be writing about a juicer produce company? Except when you have $100+ million involved, they were focused on that.
Why do you think people were then rooting so hard for Juicero to fail?
You know, we live in a world of jealousy. In 2013, there were no connected kitchen appliances, so people couldn't understand it.
If you were to point to one thing that really gave you the confidence to go into the world of sprouting that you're in now and really create a successful business that you're running today, what would you say that would be?
It's all what you focus on. Either you're a player or you're a victim.
I'm Sammi Cohen, and this is Social Currency, a podcast that unpacks the stories that are shaping business, culture, and the intersection of the two. Before we get into today's episode, please take 30 seconds to make sure you're subscribed to the show. Subscribing helps the show get bigger guests, better support, and more of the business lore that you're clearly here for. With that being said, my guest today is Doug Evans, serial entrepreneur in the wellness world and the mind behind some of the most debated consumer products of the last decade. Doug founded Organic Avenue before cold-pressed juice became a status symbol. He then went on to build Juicero, the hardware meets food startup that raised a ton of capital, went viral for the wrong reasons, and became the meme-ified symbol of Silicon Valley excess. But that's not where the story ends. I'll be honest. I have made videos around the cautionary tale of Juicero before, and I laughed along with the memes. But talking to Doug wasn't anything like what I expected, and it changed my perspective on the story. In our conversation, Doug talks about what Juicero was actually trying to solve, how a narrative can kill a company faster than product execution, and why the Bloomberg article became a cultural moment way beyond juice. We also dive into his post-Juicero chapters, raw water or lack thereof, moving to the Mojave Desert, sprouting as the anti-Juicero, and what it felt like to go from a company with 100,000 square feet of production to a business that can scale without a ton of outside capital. Plus, Doug gives his take on RFK flipping the food pyramid, what he pitched on Shark Tank last year, and the next big trend in health that he thinks everyone is sleeping on. This is Doug Evans' Social Currency. Doug Evans, welcome to Social Currency.
Thank you so much for having me, Sammi. I've been looking forward to this.
The theme for this conversation today is going to be reinvention, because Doug, you have seemingly lived through several different lives, and I'm so excited to dive into each of them with you. I want to start with something that you said that I know when my audience hears are going to find quite interesting, and they're going to want to know the why behind it. You've said that you thought that you were genetically cursed before you changed your eating habits.
Right.
So what does that mean? And how has that impacted how you look at everything that you're doing with your business and the way that you're living your life today?
So there's this fine line between what is fate and what is free will, right? So I thought my fate was that I was dealt bad genes because my aunt developed type 2 diabetes, had a double amputation of her feet, and then she died. My uncle died of heart disease. My mother, we thought she had an ulcer. She went to the hospital. She had stomach cancer, never came out. And before I could finish grieving the loss of my mother, my father got heart disease, and then he died. And my brother, who's presently alive by the skin of his teeth, is in a skilled nursing facility. He's overweight, obese, diabetic, and he's had 3 strokes and 3 heart attacks. That's what I'm talking about, genetically cursed, where I thought like, oh, okay, like this is just the hand that I was dealt. Then I realized, well, you're dealt these genes, but your lifestyle determines whether you trigger these genes to become, more mortal, or you can still turn things around and have the best life ever.
When you first started your journey into all things health and wellness, you founded a company called Organic Avenue. And a native New Yorker, I remember Organic Avenue. It was really the cool place to get your juice. And one thing I want to call out for all of my listeners who may or may not have heard of it, Doug was really ahead of the times because there was this massive juice boom in the late aughts to early 2010s. You started the company in 2002.
Right.
So what led you to start that company?
So in 1999, I had like my come to sprout moment. there was nothing in New York where I could really trust the label, the ingredients, the food safety and sanitation. So rather than most people in New York, especially that I knew, they were going out to eat all the time and drink all the time. And what I decided to do is I wanted to hire a chef to make food for me and my partner at the time, Denise, so that we could live a very clear lifestyle where everything was fresh, everything was organic. Like we didn't even want sweeteners. So if something needed to be sweet, we'd make our own date paste. And so we were just curating everything. We didn't want plastic bottles. We wanted things to be in glass. What we wanted was so far from the norm that we decided, okay, well, we'll do this for ourselves. And initially it wasn't a business. It was just something for us to do while we were doing other things. And then we ended up attracting so many people into the life where it just resonated. Like people know fresh is best, but it's so foreign because most things are processed. So fresh was best was like my motto in 1999. And by 2002, we had amassed all this equipment. I had a big loft on the Lower East Side, and people were like, hey, can you make an extra one of those? Whatever you're making, I want one. I want one. And I remember like Diane von Furstenberg was saying, hey, can I send my assistant over, for that? And then it just slowly and organically grew. We decided to open up a retail store in the Lower East Side, which was the armpit of New York City. And people would come from the entire tri-state area. And then we opened up our West Village store. And I was concerned, oh my God, that store, will it cannibalize our other store? And turns out, no, it just was like all new customers. And if one of our customers was in that neighborhood, they would go there. And that just opened up a succession of stores and momentum. And at the time, all juice that was in the store was processed in plastic bottles, pasteurized, added sugar, like a naked smoothie had 38 grams of sugar and was pasteurized, could have a 10-year shelf life. And we wanted things that were fresh, that were in a glass bottle, that was pure. And so we started to make a few items. And before we knew it, we were making 50 items every single day and distributing them to 10 stores and delivering them every morning, 7 days a week. So it just became a real kind of a manifestation of a lifestyle that adopted.
I would imagine, you mentioned naked, the fact that there were 38 grams of sugar in that.
Yeah.
And Odwalla is...
Same thing.
Yeah, another player in the space. You spoke to the growth that your company saw, and you eventually decided to sell the majority of the company in 2013. What led to that decision to sell at that point?
We ended up wanting to expand. Like we saw the growth of Howard Schultz and Starbucks. And, turns out Starbucks is really a delivery system for caffeine, for sugar, for dairy, for fat. And we thought like, hey, we're on to something here. Everywhere there's a Starbucks, there should be an Organic Avenue. Like that was my dream and vision there. And we partnered with someone who was aligned with that vision. In order to, consummate that expansion, they wanted to have control. We were like, okay, we're aligned. That makes sense. But turns out we weren't that aligned.
And I speak to so many founders on this show. Can you walk us through what happened to the business after that acquisition happened?
Soon after the transaction, probably less than a week, I was relieved of all duties.
And was that a surprise?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that was a surprise. Then they brought in an executive who was the president of a Pret-a-Manger. And, they gave him a lot of runway. They opened up dozens of stores. And then they realized that it was a really difficult business. And they decided that they didn't want to put any more time in it.
So your next venture was the infamous Juicero.
Yeah, I love Juicero.
The story is epic. What problem were you trying to solve with Juicero that you think most people today misunderstand?
What we were doing at Organic Avenue, we had a 20,000 square foot facility. We were making fresh, raw juice every day, bottling it in glass bottles, delivering it to the stores. And it was very, very hard. And it wasn't really scalable. Like that business, you couldn't actually ship raw juice over state lines, agricultural concerns with it. And what I saw was, like, I really believed in fresh, raw, unsweetened green juice, like lots of benefits to that. And that all juice that was in a bottle was pasteurized, denatured, and in plastic bottles, right? The nature of how they needed to do. So it was just non-drinkable. And people who had home juicers, they were using them once or twice a month because it's a pain. You got to go buy the produce, wash the produce, make the juice, clean the juicer. And often you don't even have the produce that you want for the juice that you need, and takes up a lot of room in the refrigerator. The cold press juice process is a two-part process. You buy all the produce, you wash it, then you dice, slice, chop, shred, and you're really creating a slurry. But it's 100% of the raw ingredients. It's just in a slurry. And then when you put in the press, you would put in a cheesecloth bag, and then you would press it, and the press would separate the juice from the fiber. So that is how cold pressed juice was made. So I saw that people who had an espresso machine, they were using it once or twice a day because it was convenient. And I said, okay, people have a countertop space, they have electricity, they have refrigeration. So if we were to take fresh juice, fresh produce, dice it, slice it, chop it, put into bags, people could put into a press, you could separate and have a fresh, raw juice, but it would still have a short shelf life, but it was optimized. The home juicers were centrifugal juicers, which were hard to clean and made a mess. And the commercial ones were presses. And the minimum price of a press, a hydraulic press system, was $2,500 for the Norwalk juicer. I looked at how could I engineer a smaller, less expensive press, and I got the price of the Norwalk down to the original Juicero, which was $6.99, which was a bargain compared to, the Norwalk, press. And then, but the most important thing was figuring out the logistics of how I could buy fresh produce from a farm. I could prepare it, put in the packs, then send out the packs so people could just press a button and get this juice on demand. And we sold thousands of machines, over 1 million packs of Juicero were served. People who had it, from professional sports teams to Whole Foods to consumers, they just loved it. They was just over the moon with it. Like, wow, I came up with an idea. I learned mechanical engineering, industrial design, large-scale manufacturing, sustainable packaging, capital raising, and I did all these things. And, the product was like a work of art. It was beautiful, it functioned, and relatively to a V1 product, it was very affordable.
The vendors that you had in place with Organic Avenue, were you able to leverage any of those same vendors for Juicero, or because of the scale, you needed to start from ground zero?
I mean, Organic Avenue was the largest independent buyer of organic produce in New York. So we were at scale, but in most greens are grown in Salinas Valley, California. So we wanted to be located as close to the farm as possible, where we were buying the produce.
The way that you got around the state line issue is because if you're selling the packs, it's not in the final juice form. In the juice form, I would imagine, because it's liquid, creates
it had a different regulatory component.
Yeah.
But the thing that Bloomberg wrote about, like that you could squeeze the pack by hand, like you could squeeze an orange by hand. You could wash your T-shirt in the kitchen sink. You don't need a washing machine. So this was a convenient device. The juicer itself was just the tip of the iceberg. Mm-hmm. Like the hard part, and where the money, was how can you, distribute these packs? So whereas we sold less than 10,000 machines, we had sold over 1 million packs of the produce. So that was the model. The business should still be here today. just got into the wrong hands.
You have said that the biggest mistake was actually letting people know how much money you had raised. And why do you feel that way?
I think I made many mistakes in that, but that was one. Because Bloomberg, like why would Bloomberg be writing about a juicer produce company? Except, when you have $100+ million involved, then they were focused on that. So it was only for them is that they were looking, what Bloomberg normally writes about is so boring that people are falling asleep, shattering their screens, looking at the terminal. Occasionally they look for something, that they can mock or that would be funny for clickbait, and Juicero, they just struck gold.
Walk me through the day you heard about that Bloomberg article. Did you get any notice that was going to come out?
No.
Or did you find out when everyone else did?
When I read the Bloomberg article, I thought it was the dumbest thing ever. Like it was a non-issue. If you couldn't squeeze the pack, there'd be something wrong, right?
Yeah.
Like could wring out a towel, right? It was just like, there was no surprise. Like people could squeeze the packs, but no one wanted to squeeze the pack. And what Bloomberg did was a little disingenuous. If you watch the video, right, it's a 2-minute video, right? They show the woman grabbing the pack. They, cut to the end of the final juice coming out. And they don't show the process of wringing it and going through, which was this pathetic, arduous process. They would have had their viewers falling asleep again had they showed the process. But with editing and lighting and funny headlines, they were able to make it a thing. But when it came out, like, I didn't think anything of it because there was no surprise.
Yeah.
There's no, there was no scandal. There was nothing illegal or wrong or misrepresenting. Like it was a premium device. I'm sure that you could walk across the country, you could bike, you could rent a car, you could fly Southwest, or you could fly business, or you could fly private. So people have their discretion of how they want to deploy their capital based on their priorities and needs. So for some people, thousands of people, they prioritized that they wanted raw, fresh, organic, cold-pressed juice, and they were willing to pay. So the interesting thing, none of our customers were upset. There was no protesting. There was no like, oh, I feel duped. It was this separate track, business, media, finance, which had nothing to do with the consumer aspect of the business.
You said that when you were reading it, you thought that there was no surprise there. However, when did you realize that this media portrayal of what Juicero was capable of was actually really gathering steam actively against your company?
The consumers were fine. The media basically did no original research. The Bloomberg article was picked up and then copied and playing the telephone game, but it was picked up by everyone. New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Business Week, Forbes, Fortune, Gizmodo, TechCrunch. It was just spiraled out of control. And they were all copying misinformation that Bloomberg, represented. And for example, Bloomberg said that 2 investors were unhappy. Which 2 investors and how much did they invest and why were they unhappy? And they had this cloak of anonymity. And only like 7 months later did I find out that Bloomberg, looked at our Reg D, went down the list and called every investor and misrepresented facts and said, hey, we're doing an expose around Juicero that you don't need the machine, that it's a fraud, and that you're basically an idiot for investing. 98 of the 100 investors didn't get back to them or the like, but 2 anonymous investors, made a comment. And one of them said, if I knew that Doug was hawking bags of juice, we never would have met with him. And that was the thing. And then the Bloomberg headline said, Juicero feeling the squeeze, investors unhappy. So they just fabricated this article. And if I was litigious, I would have had lawsuit filed. I would have had them hold all the records. I would have looked at all the takes. But I was like, this is just so pathetic. that I'm just moving on.
In your view, why do you think people were then rooting so hard for Juicero to fail?
We live in a world of jealousy. People weren't rooting for us to fail as much as like they couldn't understand. The story was never told. Like, what were we trying to achieve? Like, if you want to build a piece of hardware that has 400 parts, and today everything is connected, right? People have hundreds of connected devices. In 2013, there were no connected kitchen appliances. Wi-Fi, Bluetooth connectivity wasn't there. So people couldn't understand it. When we look at now, it's like, oh, if Juicero came out today, it would be like no one would care. It would just be like, oh, this is a convenient option. I want, this option. I'll pay the price. But, the mistakes, that I made, letting people know about the money as if it was a badge of honor, stepping down as CEO to the former chief operating officer of Coca-Cola. Oh, I'm going to listen to the board. They think that's a good idea. I'll be supportive. And I didn't realize I was falling on the sword. They decide to close the company down with tens of millions of dollars in capital left in the bank and saying, hey, we're done, pull the capital, return it, and everyone go do something else.
And so that decision, especially if there was runway left for the company to try and reverse the narrative, you said that the customers that had bought the product were still happy with it. I had seen actually in an interview that you did that you had mentioned less than 5%, or you can correct me on that number.
Yeah, low single digits.
Customers returned it once you gave them the ample opportunity to say, hey, if you're not happy. So customers were still enjoying it. Yes, there was this media frenzy, but as we know, the media headlines come and go. So why didn't the company continue on? Was there that strong of a narrative where any prospective new consumers had this tainted notion?
No.
So why would they do that?
Best examples. You see how hot AI is today. Like, I was in a meeting, with a family office, and they were trying to get into an SPV that was in another SPV that had access to secondary OpenAI shares, right? Because that was hot. When things are not, it's like a hot potato. No one wants to be any part of it. Juicero went from being very hot to just uninteresting to the parties. And then, when leadership left, the CEO that they recruited in, he was like, I don't need to be here. I was already gone and out of the company. They just said, oh, without leadership, without capital, bad press. And, they didn't care that consumers liked it. We were literally months away from launching a $199 version of the machine.
Wow.
Because the next order, hardware scales down in price as optimization. The V2 of Juicero was $199. V1 was $699. V1.5 was $399. V2 was $199. And it would have gotten down to below 100, but it had to do with scaling and parts and minimum quantities from suppliers.
So had there not been this narrative shift, especially with the $200, $199 juicer that was coming out, do you think that Juicero would still be here today?
100%. Like, especially during COVID, like, people wanted fresh access. It would have been there. It would have been, global. We had in my office, I had the CEO of Nestle coming to sit in my office. I had the president of Campbell's. I had the, senior executive team from Coca-Cola, Breville juicers. Like, people were fascinated with the machine, with the technology in part, but then, they weren't committed to it. And that was something, where Matt Higgins, wrote in his book, Burn the Boats, that you really need to get investor alignment. Because if you have investor alignment, easily could have weathered that storm. As I said before, there's nothing nefarious. No one got sick. No one broke the law. Everything was just all grown-ups. But it's interesting, as you can see, certain people, and I've had several beyond a handful of investors that were investors in Juicero that invested in the sprouting company. Investors from Juicero that have never spoken to me again. They're still like licking their wounds and feeling sorry for themselves, not understanding, the risk involved with being an investor.
Especially being an investor in an early stage company where they invested prior to you actually releasing your first product.
It's just interesting. And for me, like, I just learned so much Tony Robbins, who coached me during that time, was like, Doug, this happened for you, not to you. You're not a victim. When I realized what this incredible experience I got to go through, like, it's easy. Mike Tyson says, everyone, is a tough guy until they get punched in the face. I felt great. Like, I was in the arena. I was playing the game. I was making the decisions. I did a great unpacking at Harvard Business School, where I went through all my blind spots to 120 first and second year MBA students, being very vulnerable and sharing what I learned with them. Those were powerful experiences that have shaped who I am today.
If you were to go back and give yourself advice to Doug prior to raising that capital, what advice would you give?
I think, for one, that I needed to maintain the leadership of the company, and B, that build in private, right? I think we were too much in the public and it was a distraction. Like, it had benefit from a marketing perspective. It didn't help. Mm-hmm. Like, most of the press, business oriented, et cetera, those weren't buying our products anyway, that whole Verge and Gizmodo. And I think that's where, in hindsight, had we launched the company out of LA, which is more consumer oriented than tech oriented in Silicon Valley, and also I didn't genuflect to the tech media there. They were surprised, like, when Juicero got launched and oh, this is launched out of Silicon Valley. How come we didn't know? How come we didn't have everything? And the New York Times, broke the story on March 30th, 2015. And everyone was just surprised. And it's on the front page of the New York Times business section.
Wow.
Right? Front page. Everyone was just kind of scrambling. And I think that the tech press never forgave the company for not including them because we were operating in their backyard.
That's a spicy take.
It really is, comical when you look at it. They didn't even try the product. They didn't appreciate it. They didn't seek to understand. And for me, I think that was a difference when Bloomberg approached the company. Had I been the CEO at the time, I would have taken them, into the tent and walked them through. And instead, the then CEO gave them the finger.
When the Bloomberg piece broke, you had already been...
I was no longer CEO, probably 5 or 6 months prior to that.
How did the entire Juicero chapter affect your view on success and ambition?
I literally became, somewhat reclusive after that. It was a very traumatic experience, for me to go through, when all of a sudden I'm focused on the business. Fortunately, I never changed my lifestyle, right? I was still very simple. I never bought a car. I never bought a house. I was just working on my thing. But after Juicero, I decided I wanted to live in nature, right? And just how pathetic the press was after, and you're telling me we're going to talk about raw water. I was never in the raw water business, right? I was living in nature, drinking from streams like water. And Vice decided they wanted to have a Juicero interview. And I was like, no, I'm not talking about Juicero. And they're like, oh, well, we just saw that you did a water fast. Can we go harvest water with you? I was like, sure, you want to come? So, we went up, to Northern California to a spring, in a hike, and we're bringing our 5-gallon glass bottles. And then, all of a sudden I get ambushed, asking about Juicero. And I was like, hey guys, we're not talking about it. The reporter there asked me 10 times the same question when I said, we're not talking about it. And then I'm not media trained. I literally turned around and I said to the producer, if he asks me again, I'm walking off. And that's the cut, that they use, and the headline in Vice, Juicero founder, blah, 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 really doesn't want to talk about Juicero. It was just comical. I take people at face value, right? And I'm happy to share, but I learned so much about the power of media, the power of edits, the power of clickbait, journalism. And then I realized you're much better off just building. I love a long form, part where you can have a real conversation with people. And, that never happened. And at the time I post Juicero, like I didn't want to talk to anybody. So I lived, up in Muir Woods, just drinking water, wanting to detox everything mentally. And then I moved to Wonder Valley Hot Springs near Joshua Tree, where I live today.
Just because we jumped into it really quickly for the listeners, everything that Doug just mentioned around raw water, when I was doing research on you, that was one of the things that came up. Whenever you read a media headline, there's always at least minimum 2 sides to every story. And just know that I'm saying this as someone who does a lot of coverage on business and tech and things throughout media. There's always an angle. Even the raw water phase, it seems like you just debunked it right now. There was no raw water
There was
phase.
no raw water
But there is, I will say, because then I went on a deep dive of raw water, there is a raw water movement. There's a company called Live Water I was looking into that does exist. And then there are a lot of questions around that.
I like that water.
Yeah.
Right.
So can you give us the pitch? What is raw water versus regular water we drink?
The large water companies, right? Nestle and, I can't even think of these.
Nestle's the biggest ones, but there's
Deer Park and other things.
Mountain Valley, which is, there's actually one company that's bought up a shocking number of them.
Danone. But Mountain Valley comes from a spring, and they do glass bottles. But most of the Nestle water is groundwater that's filtered. So it's not coming, Poland Spring doesn't come from Poland, doesn't come from a spring. Right? So it's groundwater that's just being filtered and treated. And even the filters can release microparticles and microplastic in it. And intuitively, I knew that 10 years ago, right? I wanted fresh water, right, from a spring, and I didn't want things that were processed. So raw water and the thesis and what that company, Alive Water or Living Water, do, they actually found a spring in Oregon that is so pure that it's the only spring in the country that doesn't require, from a regulatory perspective, any post-processing treatment. So no UV lights, no filter. It's just pure, clean water. But if you're just taking toilet water or septic water, or LA could be recycling wastewater. So I just was hey, I'm aware of what I'm consuming, that if I can, where I am, find a spring and I can harvest it in glass bottles, that feels like a good way to get my water.
Got it.
And so that was it. I never sold raw water. I never endorsed raw water. I drank it and I'd still drink it. But, the way the articles were out was there's high risk in drinking raw water because it could have blah, 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 blah in it. We're not drinking out of a septic tank, right? So, it all depends on, like you said, the angle or the lens or both sides of the story. But yeah, given my choice, I'd rather have raw, unfiltered spring water. And by the way, any spring that I drink from, I wouldn't just go and stick my face in it. I'd take a sample, I send it back to the lab. I'd look at the whole nutrition profile because there's minerals in it and there could be pathogens. So I don't want, I value life. So I wanted safe things. And I also ran tests, on the raw water and it was good water.
And so you mentioned your move to the Mojave Desert too.
Yeah.
And you created a hot springs facility, oasis, something?
Well, basically, what I found is the only time that I can really unwind, in a meditative state, is in a bath, right? And most baths are chlorinated, right? And fluorinated. A hot chlorine bath isn't just bad because the chlorine is entering your skin. It's the fumes of the chlorine are gassy. So, but I like baths. I moved to Wonder Valley Hot Springs, where I have a geothermal mineral well, and I was filling up a cowboy tub with a hose, like a big bath. And I'm soaking under the stars in the Milky Way, and I'm living in a yurt, and everything was hunky-dory. And then I went to Bali, to visit Michael Franti from Spearhead and to get furniture, the house I was renovating. And I stumbled upon these 5,000-pound monolithic boulders that they carved into soaking tubs.
Wow. Beautiful.
And then I had this vision. It's like, oh, so I bought 6 of them and I brought them over. And then, I managed to, acquire adjacent lots and put drill a geothermal well, renovate a house, put a soaking tub, and create like Wonder Valley Hot Springs.
Listeners, if they are interested, they can stay there. It's
There's
a place you can stay for a few nights.
10 houses on Airbnb. We've had A-listers rent the whole property for, their anniversaries or parties or bachelorettes. And we also have just people who are rent a certified dark sky area. So like you can see, like in the summer when there are meteor showers, you can literally see a shooting star every minute.
Wow.
And the average night, like last 2 nights ago, we had a new moon. You could see like the Milky Way and galaxies and beyond. So I was living there. And then, I attracted my wife. So we got married on the property. Mike Posner sang at our wedding.
Wow.
And then we had a home birth on the property. So I have a 3-year-old daughter.
Oh, congrats.
And so life is just the best ever. And that wouldn't have happened, had, Juicero, gone straight up like a rocket. Like I wouldn't have had time to, become who I am today.
And that brings us to the current chapter of the Sprouting Company. So for whoever is listening who has no idea what Sprouts are about or what you're doing, can you give us the high level explanation?
Yeah. Seeds are nature's first food, right? There would be no herbivores, there'd be no grass-fed cows had they not consumed sprouted grass, right? There'd be no carnivores if they weren't eating herbivores. We wouldn't have oxygen on this planet if it didn't come from a leaf. And all begins with a seed. So seeds are complete living organisms in a dormant state. Seeds like literally have energy inside of them. They have an embryo, they have an endosperm, and they're dormant. My insight, which is not new, sprouting's been around since the beginning of time. My insight was that sprouts are food, sprouts are vegetables, and that they grow without soil, sunshine, or fertilizer. So if you can take seeds and germinate them and sprout them, you get this like trifecta. You get food, you get vitamins and minerals, and then you get medicine. It's not only a longevity medicine, it can help regulate insulin levels in diabetics. It can detoxify benzene and air pollutants from the lungs. It has this whole range of killing cancer cells. Like there's more than 2,000 peer-reviewed published papers on sulforaphane, the compound inside of broccoli seeds alone. When I moved to the desert, not only was it a food desert, it was an environmental desert. So I'm like in a double desert, no food, no Santa Monica's farmer's market, no Air One, no places for me to eat. I was like, oh, well, I really like it here. I don't like driving 90 minutes, to go to a health food store. I'm just going to sprout. So in 1 cubic foot with like 6 jars and some seeds, I was growing thousands of calories a day of sprouts.
Which is hard to do because sprouts are very low in calories,
well,
right?
It's interesting. Certain sprouts like broccoli are low in calories, but green peas, mung beans, lentils, garbanzo beans, 1 jar is 1,000 calories.
Oh, wow.
So in 6 jars, I was getting thousands of calories a day just by rotating, which sprouts I was consuming. And the interesting thing is the potency and the nutritional density of the sprouts 10 to 100 times that of mature vegetables.
Whoa.
So I knew a lot about vegetables. And here it's like, wow, sprouts are super potent. And the sprouts contain the meristematic stem cells of the plants. So they're very active. They're enzymatically charged. They're just tender. So you're getting the soluble and insoluble fiber. You're getting all of the phytonutrients, the chlorophylls, the carotenoids. So you're getting this body of mass where it's so potent, and you grow the sprouts without soil, sunshine, or fertilizer in days. It was like, wow, how come no one knows about this? And right, so, John Mackey was my largest corporate customer at Whole Foods, right? So I reached out to John, I had dinner with John, and I'm like, John, what do you think of sprouts? He's like, oh, sprouts are terrific, but it's a shitty business. I said, what do you mean? He goes, short shelf life, low margins. There are no national or international sprouting companies. It's all regional. It's all mom and pop. There's nothing big. And I was like, oh, okay. So I just got to grow my own, right? Mm-hmm. So I started to grow my own. I reached out to some people on the medical side, Dr. Mark Hyman, Dr. Dean Ornish, Dr. Josh Axe, Dr. Joel Furman, Dr. Joel Kahn. They all loved sprouts, whether they were keto or functional medicine or plant-based. They all loved sprouts. Like literally for a second, I contracted thinking like, oh, they're gonna take my idea. They're gonna write the sprout book. But turns out everyone has their own shtick, right? Like they're doing their own thing. And for entrepreneurs, it's very clear. Don't worry about what other people think. No one's going to copy you. Just do your thing and do it really well. I went to New York, with my idea of writing the sprout book. I pitched one publisher, Macmillan, St. Martin's Press, and Elizabeth Beyer was like, wow, Doug, there's never been a book, about sprouting done by a major publisher. I think we'll do it. And I think I got the smallest advance they've ever given.
How much was it?
$20,000.
Hey, that's better than nothing.
I don't know any of my friends, authors, that have less than $100,000 advance. I don't know anybody.
Yeah.
And I know people that I can't believe the size of the advances that they got. For me, like I thought, in hindsight, that was a gesture that would disincentivize me to take the offer.
You wrote the book. We have the Sprout book here. And at the time when you wrote this book, you were just very enthralled with everything about sprouts. But was the idea for the full company intact yet?
No. At the time, I literally, this was just a project for me, just like to share my captain's logs and my information. It was kind of like a gift that I wanted to give to the world, like my view and lens about all about sprouting, how to sprout, what to sprout, nutrition about sprouting, recipes for sprouting. The book became a national bestseller, sold over 75,000 copies, of the book. Number one in many, many categories, and actually was in the top 100 of all books on Amazon.
Wow.
So it was just like, wow. And I've never wrote anything in my life. We didn't talk about these chapters in my life, but I never went to college, right? So I joined the Army at 17. So for me to write 288 pages, close to 60,000 words, was this monumental task, focus of me locking in. But I was very excited about sprouts.
So you see that there are clearly a ton of people who share that same interest because you sold that many copies of this book. At what point did you decide that you were going to launch the company off of it?
What happened is, I never thought I was going to work again. The trauma from Juicero was very real. My trust was compromised. I never thought I would date again. When Juicero got shut down, my girlfriend cheated on me and moved with another guy, and so everything was just collapsing. When I wrote the book, I just wanted to give my gift and I wasn't motivated, for material things. And then what happened is, people were saying, hey, I want to sprout. Current level of equipment was just antiquated. There hadn't been any money behind sprouts for the aforementioned reasons. And so people were using a mason jar and cheesecloth. And the mason jar was designed for canning and the shape. And turns out when you sprout, you want to have good drainage. So I had to design a jar that had, straight edge so the water would go. Mm-hmm. And then this is, twice the size of a normal quart mason jar. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to be pretty and bespoke, but because it was big, I wanted to be able to grab it. So I designed these detents and getting the threads on the outside. And then the normal, the cheesecloth was actually collecting biofilm and exudate. So when the white cheesecloth was turning brown, that's like bacteria. And every time you rinse it, you're getting more. So I want to have a stainless steel filter. And then I want it to be at the right, the nice angle to fit, it's the perfect angle. So it all like made sense in product design to put it all together. So this didn't exist. And then on the seed side, it was like the wild, wild west. You could go into Whole Foods and you could grab seeds from the bulk bin, and they may or may not germinate. I knew enough about agriculture. I always loved seeds. I'd been sprouting now for 30 years, but I never thought of sprouts seriously. I always thought of them as a garnish or a side dish. And then now, like, my mind was blown, and I realized like sprouts were the original superfood. These were words, plants that I was familiar with. And it turns out in the tiny stage, they were super powerful. What I wanted to have for sprouting for me and my friends, and now I can sincerely say tens of thousands of people are using this. And it's a, very successful DTC, brand. And I remember when I auditioned for the Shark Tank, the casting agent was like, sprouts? Like, no, I don't think this is this doesn't feel like a Shark Tank, company because it's so niche, blah, blah, blah. And, once the producers, heard the pitch, they're like, oh, the sharks will love this.
You also, speaking of Shark Tank, because I watched that episode before you came in, at one point during the presentation, you take this blanket or curtain off of this device, which you called a sprouting robot, which when I looked at it, it looked like an ancient ancestor from the Juicero machine. It was also kind of this rectangular device. What in the world is that?
That's a fully autonomous sprout growing machine, fully autonomous sprouting robot. What I learned from Juicero was that it can't cost, $699. So it'll cost like $199 or $299 when it comes out. So I really engineered what it would be like on V2 into my V1.
I'm excited for that because I think that anything that requires human intervention, especially when you're growing, my husband has a green thumb. I have a little bit less so I like the fully automated one too.
There's room for both. And now that we can see it, and after I'll show you a video of it, it's really hot and it works, and we have patents on it. But I wanted to, give the sharks a little glimpse of it, and they got really, excited about it.
Earlier on, you mentioned that Mike Posner sang at your wedding, and right before we started taping, you had a call come in from Mike, and you had mentioned that he's involved in this.
Oh, he's a co-founder.
He is a co-founder. Okay,
Yeah.
How in the world, it sounds like you have known Mike for a while. How did this even happen?
So I met Mike right after his dad died, after Juicero got shut down. And we just became friends.
How does one just become friends with Mike Posner?
We bumped into each other. I didn't know who he was. He didn't know who I was. And we just started to hang out that afternoon. We spent like six hours together that day.
Where was this?
This was at the TED conference in Vancouver. A little bit of a protected environment, safe, but I didn't even have my name tag on. Like, I had so much shame from Juicero. At the time, I didn't have my name tag on. And Mike didn't know anything about that. And I never gave myself the gift of music. So I didn't know any of his songs. I didn't know who he was. And he had a big beard and he was getting ready to walk across the country. Chemistry. And we just clicked. And then Mike came, to Wonder Valley, and we hung out and I'd go to the studio. We just got to know each other on a, different level.
Wow. Worlds colliding.
And then 3 years ago, Mike was depressed and asked if I knew any coaches. So I introduced him to Tony Robbins. And so Tony says, look, I only coach 5 people one-on-one the course of the year, but I'm having this date with destiny. Why don't you invite Mike, and come? So I took Mike to Date with Destiny. and they didn't allow any outside food into the venue. But I have a doctor's note that says I can eat sprouts. So I brought my notes. So as we're jumping around, I'm sharing my sprouts. And Mike got a taste of sprout energy, of eating the sprout energy. And he was on a totally different trip at the time. And he was like, wow. And then, he started to sprout. And then he started to send like mason jars and cheesecloth and like these kits. And then Mike writes a song every day, right? And Mike has summited Mount Everest, and he's walked across America 2 times, east to west, and then north to south. He just finished the Continental Divide. And so he really cares about these things. And sprouts like played a pivotal role, in helping him feel good. So he was like, hey, I want to be part of this. If you go deep back, prior to his walk across America, he did a lot of posts, and now we talk on strategy. And then Mike reintroduced me to Gary Vee, who started to help us on the media side. And, Mike is just phenomenal. We talk almost every day. I wouldn't say he's a silent partner. Like, he's still writing his music. He's writing his book. He's engaged, he's having a beautiful life, but this is just something, that he's very passionate about in his life.
I love that. That's such a cool story and meeting of different worlds. And it's always fascinating when you meet someone who's in a completely different industry, stage of life, everything. And then yet you have so much in common from just a soul level. My question for you, because you did earlier on, you brought up the fact that your life post Juicero, there was a lot of trauma, a lot of, oh my gosh, I don't know if I'll ever really do these big things again. If you were to point to one thing that really gave you the confidence to go into the world of sprouting that you're in now and build a business and be more vocal about it and really create a successful business that you're running today, what would you say that would be?
It's all what you focus on. Either you're a player or you're a victim. And when I processed the fact that I did my best, like, I made so many correct decisions in the 5 years I worked on Juicero. Like, we shipped product. Like, there was like the Lily drone that raised tens of millions of dollars and Kickstarter that never shipped and never worked. Like, we did what we said we were going to do, but in hindsight, the market wasn't ready, right? The market wasn't ready. Today, it would be more ready. Connected devices make more sense. And, price point was there. But when I saw the power of sprouts and I looked at the market and I said, there's no one doing this. There's no one going to do it like the leaders of the sprouting world, Ann Wigmore and Viktoras Kovinskis, Steve Meyerowitz, the original Sprout Man, all dead. They're all dead. There was never a book by it. They never knew about social media. They never went on any podcast. They never had the Juicero experience or the Organic Avenue experience. So I felt like those experiences shaped me. Like Abraham Lincoln said, if he had 8 hours to cut down a tree, he'd spend 7 hours sharpening the saw. The 2 decades I spent on Juicero and Organic Avenue was just me sharpening the saw, just sharpening the saw.
It's a good way to look at it.
You can Google Doug Evans and Steve Jobs, and you'll see an interview that I did with Steve in 1993 when Steve had a full head of hair before he went back to Apple, smiling, laughing.
What was that interview?
About graphic design.
This is pre-Organic Avenue.
Pre-Organic, yeah.
What were you doing at the time?
I was doing graphic design.
That makes sense.
I was doing graphic design. So prior to going into the Army, I wrote graffiti on subway trains. And when I got out of the Army, the most legitimate vocation was graphic design. And so I took a 7-year internship with a legendary graphic designer named Paul Rand, who designed IBM, ABC, UPS, Westinghouse, and had a little known client called Next Computer. And so he was working with Steve on the Next corporate identity. And Paul was teaching the master's program at Yale on graphic design. And I called up Paul and I was like, hey, I'm really interested in graphic design. I read your book and, I'd like to learn. And like Paul hung up the phone on me. And, just getting out of the army and having drill sergeants, like, who cares? He hangs up, I'll call again. And so I called up again and I went to meet Paul and we had this like deep connection. Like Paul like marveled, at my energy. Like he just loved me. And we could never talk about money. So I worked for him for free for 7 years, from picking up sticks, shoveling snow, setting type, interfacing between him and Steve Jobs and other clients until the day that Paul passed in the hospital. He died of stomach cancer. And like I was in the hospital the day that he died. When Paul got sick and I knew that he wasn't going to make it, and he really liked Steve. They had a very like close connection, but Paul was very also private and not very effusive, but he respected Steve. And so I called Steve and I said, Steve, I'd love to interview you about Paul because I think Paul would love to see, perspective, and you guys, you're running a company. He doesn't have a lot of time. And Steve's like, sure, come out. So I went out to Next and I brought a camera guy, pre-social media, right? 1993. And, had a 45-minute chat with Steve on the lawn of Next Computer. And I put up a little 7-minute clip of it on YouTube.
Wow. Okay. So everyone who's listening needs to go back and find that because that sounds like a fascinating conversation.
Yeah. And Paul loved Steve and Steve loved Paul.
Wrapping up this Sprout conversation, my last question for you on this is, what does success look like for you with the Sprouting Company?
There are things that are now things that weren't things. Kombucha and protein powder and AG1 and air fryers, coconut water. Like when I grew up, you only had coconut water if you went to the Caribbean, right? And now coconut water is ubiquitous. You can get it in literally every gas station, in the country, if not the world. So to me, I want to see sprouting just becoming more mainstream and more adapted because faster, cheaper, fresher, more nutritious. It literally checks off every box. One of the things I love about sprouting is that in my world, I loved fresh, right? Organic Avenue theme, fresh. Juicero theme, fresh. Sprouts, seeds, shelf stable, right? But add water and you get fresh. So all of the things that I've been encumbered with in the last 20 years, I'm no longer encumbered with, right? Low cost hardware, low cost, shelf stable seeds, miracles happening because you can literally take a quarter cup of seeds and in 5 days, it will grow a full jar of sprouts. So 10 grams of seeds turns into 100 grams of sprouts, 10x. So, with a juicer, you put, 100 grams of produce in, you get 50 grams of juice and 50 grams of unusable fiber. A blender, what you put in, you get out, right? 1-to-1. With a sprouter, you put 10 in, you get 100 out. It's exponential. So sprouts represent this abundant, expanding universe where imagine one seed, like one broccoli seed, if planted and nurtured, will grow into a broccoli plant, broccoli vegetable, 5 pounds. It's like one seed will turn into 5 pounds. That vegetable, if left to grow, not eaten, will then flower and then fruit. And then inside the fruit, there are pods, there'll be thousands of seeds. So one seed will replicate itself 1,000-fold, in a cycle, in a season. So seeds are the most infinite, most abundant source. And people are concerned with nutrition deficiency, water. It takes 1,500 gallons of water to grow a pound of beef. And you can grow a pound of sprouts with 1 gallon of water. So 1,500 times more efficient on the use of water. There's so many things about the sprouts. Now we have people where I don't know the latest estimate, but greater than 50% of Americans are going to be on a weight loss drug in this decade, right? And why? Because they're eating things that are melt in your mouth, high calorie, highly processed, low nutrients. Sprouts are the optimum, most efficient weight management food that I could possibly think of because they're high fiber, high nutrient, low calorie, low fat. So you could eat as many sprouts as you want. And, guess this, you eat a lot of sprouts, they actually naturally secrete GLP-1 in your gut. But unlike a shot, which lasts for a week and bricks your stomach, this fills you up, tells the brain, hey, I got my nutrient, get out of your scarcity mode, you're good, you're full, and you can go to the next thing. What's success? Like I want to see tens of millions of countertop gardens, AKA sprouters on people's kitchen countertops. And my thesis is that all produce should be grown locally and consumed locally. So the idea of shipping things in refrigerated trucks on trains is just destroying the environment. Like this is just makes so much sense. The sacrifice of Juicero to birth the sprouting movement was well worth it.
Sprouts needs a PR shift, and clearly you're leading the charge or one of the leaders of this movement.
Yeah.
Because it has gotten a bad rap. And so you're here to change that.
Oh, yeah. I mean, literally 8 years ago, if you Googled sprouts, you'd see about mold and bacteria. Now you Google sprouts, nutritional density.
There we go. Okay, so we're going to go to questions that I ask every guest. The first one is, can you share a system that you have in place that benefits your career or business?
Most important thing is before I get in any meeting, one-on-one group meeting, is to literally ask, what is my intention of the meeting? What is my highest order of service? Like, how can I make this meeting, this interaction benefit the most people in the most positive way? Every meeting, every time, sometimes it could take 10 seconds. Sometimes I can go deep for 5 minutes.
What am I trying to do and how can I serve other people while I'm doing it?
Yeah.
I love that. I'm going to steal that from you.
Okay.
So my next question, I'm really excited for your answer on this. So this comes from the Social Currency Corner, where I get your input on a trend or story that's impacting business culture. At the beginning of this year, RFK decided to flip the food pyramid on its head. Now meat, dairy, and healthy fats are at the top of the food pyramid, right next to vegetables and fruit. So as someone who has been in the health and wellness space for a while, what is your take on this massive change?
I mean, something doesn't add up on the pyramid. Like it doesn't add up because the recommendation is still 10% of your calories should come from saturated fat, which doesn't warrant giving it, the top left angle of the pyramid. There's something that looks off. I don't know whether the AI model that did that hallucinated, based on conflicting inputs. I don't understand it. Like, I think the evidence, science-based evidence, is very clear on saturated fat. So to go to that seems like NFW, like I have no idea. But what I will say, the documentation about no processed food, I think is very good. I really think like what's missing from their sprouts. It's just missing.
Course.
I'll show you. I rendered my own version of the triangle.
Oh, of course.
Of the pyramid.
Yes. Okay. We need to see that. So let's end with some advice. For this part, we have a question from Jake. What is the next big trend in health that you are the most excited about and why?
Like Mike Posner doesn't have a smartphone anymore, doesn't text.
So analog. We're going analog.
Yeah. We're going back to basics.
So if he doesn't text, is it email or how do you?
I call. He has a phone. He has a call. He has a
Yep.
simple phone.
Okay.
He takes calls. He takes voicemail. Doesn't text. And of course, he's still on email and he's on his computer. What I've done is like my phone is almost exclusively now on Do Not Disturb.
Mine is too. It's actually always in the focus mode.
Yeah.
So I don't get pings constantly.
Yeah. So it's always there. Certain people might call, so it goes through because he's so hard to get a hold of. Like, if he calls, I was like, okay, I better take his call.
Yeah, that's the thing. You gotta be very responsive when they do reach out. Doug, thank you so much for this conversation. I think that this conversation, I was really excited to sit down with you because I think so many people who have followed your journey may have these preconceived notions of everything that happened with Juicero. And also, I think that there's so much to talk about with what you're doing now, and just to hear the excitement and the passion you have for it, and also the science-backed elements, which in today's day and age with our current backwards food pyramid, we have to go back to the science of what's actually healthy for you.
Well, that's where I feel that this was connecting the dots through the invisible string. Had I not done Organic Avenue, like, I wouldn't have done Juicero and I wouldn't have done the sprouts, right? So, it's not for us to decide. Like, for me, I just need to show up. And that's where, when we began, it's like, what is your fate and what is your free will? So what happens is, clearly I didn't want to be, publicly eviscerated and crushed. No one wants that.
No.
Right? But like, that's what was real. And that's what was happening. And so I realized, like, I now, do 300 plus push-ups every day. Right? So I did 100,000 push-ups last year. 100,000. I do not like doing push-ups. I don't like them. And so I had to meditate and ask myself, like, why don't I like them? And I realized, like, biologically, we are wired not to expend energy. Our program is like, that's a waste. So I have to overcompensate, like, the biological programming to do something that isn't fun, doesn't feel good, and expends energy. In the course of doing this, like, I realized the sprouts, it's not going to happen by itself, right? And it's really hard to create both a movement and a business simultaneously. But it's just total blue ocean. I don't have to, I could talk about sprouts all day long. No one's rushing to compete in the sprout space.
That's true. That's
right?
True.
There's no one rushing here.
Yeah. If anyone's going to make it happen, it's going to be you.
It's already happening. Like, I'm just a conduit.
Thank you so much for coming on. This has been
My
great.
pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Social Currency. Before you go, take a second to subscribe to the show wherever you're listening so you never miss an episode. And if you liked what you heard today, please rate and review the podcast. It massively helps the work I do to bring this show to life. And if you have a friend who is as obsessed with business and culture as you are, send this episode to them, because sharing the show is one of the best ways to support it. And if you want to keep up with the hottest business lore in real time, follow me on Instagram at Sammi Cohen Talks, and subscribe to my newsletter, Social Currency, linked in the show notes. Social Currency is a production of Social Currency Media and Money News Network. The podcast is hosted and executive produced by me, Sammi Cohen, and produced by the Money News Network team. See you next time.